Hi, KRB teachers. Welcome to week 8 and the final week of the Maximinds Mental Healthcare webinar series. Today, we are focusing on extra support and help and how you can learn when and how to escalate. A trigger warning to start that the following presentation will contain references to mental illness and suicide. If you do find this harmful, distressing, or traumatizing, please feel free to stop the recording at any point and reach out for support. A recap as to the 8 webinar series topics that we've already covered. And today, our final one is extra support and help. So to start with, as an introduction, what will we be learning about today? Firstly, what is extra support and help and why you should seek it? When you should escalate to obtain that extra support and help, how to do this and escalate, and finally, where do you escalate to? So here is an outline of what today we'll be covering. Just to start with, I would ask if you can please scan the QR code, if that is available to you, to answer a couple of questions to see how your overall understanding has developed throughout the course of the 8 weeks, and also if you have any further feedback or questions that you would still like to be answered, then I can come back to you on those. I'll just give you 30 seconds. Thank you very much for doing that. So to start with, what is extra support and help? Well, ultimately, we at Maximinds define extra support and help as the additional resources that may be needed in both the short and the long term to assist you as teachers in identifying and managing a student's mental health and illness. So a couple of things to draw out. We're going to look at, well, what are these resources? What are the short-term or the long-term resources that you would need to access, and what are the differences between those? And also, how do you ultimately help to identify and manage illness in your students? So to start with, additional resources are essentially 3 different sorts. Firstly, it's about the information, so mental health information literacy. Secondly, it's about the assessment and diagnostic tools that you may need to help with that initial diagnosis stage to understand, firstly, what is the concern at hand. And then thirdly, additional resources may be the intervention, treatment, and different management tools that can help you in working with your students. So in terms of the short-term versus long-term resources, in the short term, these would ideally be immediate strategies that you can utilise straight away. This can involve referring students to those self-help strategies and typically can be managed by themselves as the student or with your support. On the other hand, long-term strategies and resources are those that may involve additional training and development, both for you and also for your students. And students may require ongoing, more in-depth support. And typically, this requires more of the professional support that's above and beyond what you and or your student can manage themselves. So ultimately, and we looked at this right back at the start, is that the key role that you have as teachers is that you are almost the conjugate between these additional resources and the student. And you're that segue between the two. So it's ultimately learning what are the additional steps and supports that are available to you to then help give to students. Ideally, also, it will be how do we help students to help themselves and avoid you having to be that middle person in between the two so that they can ultimately access and know where to go to get those extra support and help when they need it, but also saving you the time and the energy and the knowledge of having to know what to do in these different situations. So it's both using you as the first point of contact in some situations, but also how do we help them to help themselves. So what is the importance of getting this extra support and help for yourself, but also ultimately for your students? Well, of course, you as teachers are already very overloaded. This is a couple of pictures which may resonate with you. I guess the feeling of having lots of things going on in your mind already that you've already got to do as teachers. You're already very over capacity, I'm sure, in terms of what you do have to do. And then on top of that, having to consider the emotions of your students is, of course, a lot. So totally appreciate that you have already got a lot going on. So ultimately, the idea of extra support and help is trying to help reduce that burden that just sits on your workload, so that you can ultimately focus on teaching and feeling more recharged and not overloaded, and ultimately so that you can get through what you have to do as teachers. We have looked at this previously, but I do want to remind you that your role is crucial. So even in that process, we still helping students to get their help themselves. You as teachers are in the position where you can actually help to detect those early signs of issues, and the earlier the intervention, the better. That ultimately helps students not only personally outside the classroom, but of course academically to help them thrive at school. And your role as teachers particularly have that oversight and visibility, which means that you can gauge what's changing day to day or week to week with your students, but also what's typical for for instance, a year 9 student. So your role definitely is crucial in helping students to access the extra support and help when they need to. Another list of benefits of seeking extra support and help both for you and your students. So, of course, as mentioned, the timely identification and intervention of mental illness is key. The earlier we can identify, the earlier we can manage, and that results in better outcomes. It helps obviously foster a stronger student-teacher relationship between you and your students. It helps with better tracking and monitoring of that progress, so that when we know, again, there's already an identified issue, that can be managed and tracked. It helps to reduce cognitive bias and blind spots that we have naturally as humans. Greater communication between not only you and your students, but also other people that are involved. It helps you to identify and make the necessary adjustments for particular students who may need that extra support, and also helps then to make more informed decision making, both for you and your students. And as mentioned, that greater collaboration and communication with people like their parents, other teachers where necessary, counsellors, etc. So to start with, I want to recap the support and help strategies that we've already looked at a high level, and we can then extend onto these today. So a reminder that what we try to do at Maximinds, and ultimately hopefully lots of psychologists that do try and firstly identify mental illness, manage it for you as then teachers, and of course then channel to extra support. So today the focus is really on that third element of channeling, but I did want to give you a recap and remind you that the tools and techniques that are available to you in terms of the identification and management, those two stages in the first instance that we've already looked at. Because of course, in order to ultimately direct students somewhere, we need to have already identified and managed, at least in the first instance. So a reminder of the different sorts of things that are available to you in terms of the identification process. You do have the option to firstly take quizzes. So we looked at this previously. So another way that you can also identify warning signs is by going onto Maximinds, going into take quizzes. And here you will see there's a range of different quizzes that you can take, which help you map warning signs onto certain mental illness disorders. So to give you the example of anxious, you can click on take the quiz, go through some admin, And then here you'll be presented with a series of questions which ask you to identify whether these warning signs or behavioural indicators have been present in your student in the last 2 weeks. So for example, just to demonstrate, you would go through here, and as you'll see, these are all related to different warning signs that we've already spoken about for anxiety. Click submit. And as you'll see here, it'll come up with a result saying that it appears your student has been experiencing a bit of anxiety this week. So we would suggest you retake the quiz in another few weeks, but in the meantime, you can go here to manage anxiety, which will direct you to tools that you can use with your student. So for example, my student is anxious. That's what we've just found. And here are certain strategies that can help you. So in addition to actually taking the quizzes in the first instance to identify, you can also watch a range of videos to help identify different types of mental illnesses. So again, going on the anxiety example, here is an example of what anxiety actually is.
Anxiety is a scary, often overused and misunderstood concept. With anxiety, students may worry about the same thing over and over, consuming their life and always feeling on edge. Anxiety has physiological impacts affecting our body. We may feel hot and sweaty, jittery and nervous, have trouble breathing, and a quick heart rate. Anxiety is an extreme form of stress occurring over long periods of time. We all need a normal amount of stress to perform, but too much is when we have anxiety. Anxiety can be managed and dealt with, but must be professionally treated. Maxing Minds offers you the tools, learnings, and treatment to help you deal with your students' anxiety head-on. We can use stress to our advantage. It's all about channeling it in the right way.
So then after you have been able to identify any concern regarding your students' mental health and well-being, then it's on to managing. And we've already seen after doing the quiz that can direct you to some of the strategies, but I wanted to show you 3 other ones that are available to you to help. And this is what we use in the short term when we talk about those are more immediate strategies that can help you, that also then you can direct students to as well. So to start with, read articles. There are plenty of articles that are all grounded in both cognitive behavior therapy and also scientific research, which are available to you to explain at a high level what are different types of mental illnesses, but also how you can go about navigating that with your students, and also some examples from clients that have these sorts of illnesses or hypothetical stories almost. Another way to help you to manage those more immediate emotional and mental health challenges in the classroom are, of course, different strategies that are available online. And we saw, again, just before in that first video, that you can be directed to some particular strategies when you do a quiz, but there's also a huge amount, over 50 different strategies that you can use as well online, depending on what the types of behaviours you're noticing in students. So just wanted to show you one example of one type that you may want to use when managing anxiety.
Another tool teachers can use is by incorporating sensory engagement activities into their lessons to support students' well-being. By engaging their senses, such as identifying 5 things they can touch, 4 things they can see, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing they can taste, students are able to connect more deeply with their learning experiences. Sensory engagement helps students stay present, enhances their learning experience, and promotes their mental well-being.
And as another way to help you to manage different emotional challenges in the classroom, or of course, there's a range of downloadable activities online as well. We've looked at these throughout, but these are also things that you can just download and print and give in terms of those more short-term immediate strategies, which can help with the extra support for you in the classroom. And of course, thirdly, when it comes to the channeling to extra support and help, the more useful technique, which is used in the instance when there's that more longer term intervention needs to happen, or of course, more severe, is the option to refer to a psychologist. And this is above and beyond what you already have available to you at KRB and directing to the counselling team. And we'll look at how that can also be done. But just so you know, that is another option that is available to you. So, how do you, as teachers, identify when to escalate and when to go to resources such as Maximize to refer to a psychologist or to refer to the counselling team? So, the time to escalate is once you've already tried these things. Firstly, looking at immediate strategies such as Maximize that you can try to manage the concern. You've already tried classroom management strategies yourself to try and manage the behaviour and emotion. You've also already put in place academic support, which hasn't led to any noticeable improvement. And you've also already referred students to the self-help strategies. So once all of these are exhausted, we'll look at what to do. You may also feel that the situation is actually beyond your expertise, capacity, and comfort level. And we touched on this before, but firstly, appreciating that you are teachers, you're not expected to know how to deal with their any mental illness or acute mental illness crises in the classroom. And that would be when it is above and beyond your own expertise. So you simply just don't know how. You don't know how to help students who you can clearly see do need that extra support. You also may not have the capacity, and we looked at this as well, appreciating you're already very overloaded with doing what you need to do as a teacher. You may not have that extra additional time and resource available to you. And finally, you may feel the situation's beyond your comfort level and you're just not confident in your own ability. That is another good reason as to when it's time to escalate and to seek that extra support and help. In addition to that, and recognizing your own self-awareness, it's also looking at the student that you're focused on at the time and have a concern about. So when you notice in them 3 different things that we're going to look at, that's also a time to escalate. So firstly, that you've noticed the warning signs, either general or specific, that we've covered, and I'll give you a recap of what those are to look out for. Secondly, you've noticed a changed behaviour in amongst themselves. Also, you've noticed an atypical behaviour, for instance, what's expected of a Year 11 student on the whole, and also that impact, and we'll look at that. And thirdly, you've noticed that clinically significant distress, which means it's impacting not only their home life, but also their school life and vice versa. It's occurring over a 2-week period at a minimum. As we know, that's the minimal time that has to occur in order for a mental illness disorder to arise, or most importantly, there is a fundamental safety risk or the student is in danger. And of course, I'm sure all of these you are already across as your own duty of care, but to go into it specifically in relation to mental illness, firstly, if you see any of these general warning signs, and we have looked at these in depth, so I won't go all through them again, but just to remind you, these are the things that we're looking out for. So at a high level, warning signs relate to their mood, concentration, energy, social changes, academics, eating or exercising in excess or extreme, physical changes, risk-taking, overwhelmed, esteem, and motivation. Within those, the specific warning signs concerning particular mental disorders. I won't go through all of these, but they are on the screen to remind you of the particular warning signs to look out for particular mental illnesses. Secondly, you'll want to escalate when you notice a changed behaviour, atypical behaviour, and or impact. So changed behaviour is, of course, looking at different patterns and recognizing different patterns or behaviors or personalities than prior within that student. So they, for instance, may not have normally got quite agitated in the lead up to an exam. They may normally be quite relaxed at that time, but suddenly you've noticed they've changed to what they were like before. Atypical is when they have different behaviors and moods and emotions that would be typical of their peers in the same age and stage. And thirdly, the impact, which we've looked at, so that causes that clinically significant distress, which impairs not only their school, but also their home life. So if you see any or all of these as well, it's another good indication that it's time to probably escalate. And finally, and possibly most importantly, the obvious ones to escalate are when there is a level of high distress in students. So you may see that they're having issues concentrating, for instance, over extended periods of time. That's really causing them a concern. It also has to happen at a minimum of the 2 weeks, as we've looked at, minimum for a mental illness disorder diagnosis. And then, of course, any potential safety risk or danger to the student, which could include, but not limited to, suicidal ideation or if you're noticing any self-harm. So now that we've looked at when to escalate, let's move on to how to actually escalate when you do suspect that one of your students may have a mental illness disorder. Of course, it depends firstly on what information you're provided with in the first place and how to determine whether you do and how to escalate. So we've looked at this previously in terms of whether young people with a mental illness disorder actually seek informal support from school staff. Of course, only half of students we know and half of your girls at KRB will actually reach out. So for those 1 in 2 that actually do seek that informal support, whether it be speaking to you as their classroom teacher or perhaps a year coordinator or pastoral care tutor, there is a specific way, and we've looked at this, but I want to recap. How do you respond in that moment when they do come to you with a concern? So the immediate actions you can take are to validate, listen, and then act. So we're going to go into reminding you as to how to do that and how to actually escalate and respond when they do come to you with a concern. So a reminder that validation is about saying something like, I'm sorry to hear you're feeling sad. You must be going through a very hard time. Thank you for telling me that. Other things to say to validate are, I'm here for you. Understandably, you must feel like crying. So really reinforcing what they've already told you. Unhelpful things may be saying, I know how you feel, and try and just focus on your schoolwork. The second stage is to listen. So to say to them something like, I'm here for you. Would you like to talk about it now or with me after class? So really giving them the empowerment to decide how they want to take this forward and whether they do want to start that escalation process. Other things you could say would be, I can't imagine what you're going through, or this must be really impacting you. Unhelpful statements, I lost my mum around the same age too. Do you want to go to the school counsellor? So unhelpful in this case, potentially because it's about them and also you're wanting to seek what they want to do as the resolution rather than impose your solution upon them. And finally, in terms of acting, and so this is where we start the escalation process if necessary. So asking them, for instance, well, what can I do to help support you with your schoolwork or otherwise? Other things you might want to say to them would be, well, how can I help? Where would you like to go to from here? So again, really encouraging and empowering them to come to you with obviously this information and then helping them to problem solve and ask what your role would be from their perspective. Unhelpful things would again suggest to them what they should do, like, for instance, go and tell all your teachers, or I will book you in with the counsellor, which is unhelpful because it's not giving them the choice and agency and autonomy to decide as to where to go from here. We will look at what to do specifically in terms of the action from your behalf if and when you do notice those signs that we looked at just before, which is when you should escalate, regardless of whether they think it's suitable or not. So those things that we looked at, for instance, if there's a danger to themselves, if you're noticing self-harm, if they've got that distress for multiple weeks, and those sorts of warning signs that you're picking up. So that's for those 1 and 2 that actually do come to you. But how do we escalate for those 1 and 2 that actually don't reach out? And we've looked a lot at spotting, obviously, the warning signs, attending to behavioural cues and non-verbal, which are really important to help understand and interpret thoughts and feelings, being hyper observant, those sorts of skills. But in terms of more looking at the structured conversations to how that could look, we'll go into that now. So how do you really guide healthy conversations for those that aren't coming to you? So 3 stages again. Firstly, approach. Secondly, communicate. And thirdly, act. So in terms of the approach, find a time and a place where you won't be interrupted and that suits you both. And this could be offline or online. Communicate. So objectively, which is by using the observed behaviours that you've seen, share what you've noticed in terms of those warning signs or those things you've already picked up and observed. For instance, did they not used to be so stressed or anxious up in the lead up to exams and they suddenly are, and that's happening for an extended period of time, for instance. And then act. So identify if the issue can be self-managed or requires outside help, and then proceed accordingly, which is similar to what we just looked at before as well, even if they are coming to you. So in terms of the first stage approach, it could be something as simple as saying to the students, I want to have a quick chat to you. Do you have 15 minutes sometime this week? The reason why this is something that's light and easy is it's a quick chat. It's not a serious sit-down meeting. 15 minutes, it shouldn't take too much time. So they're probably, hopefully not going to think straight away. It's something very serious that they need to prepare for. And giving them the option to give you some time puts that control and autonomy back in their hands, which of course, as we know, is good to help them feel more empowered, particularly if you're going to talk about something that's quite personal and potentially quite uncomfortable to them. So really giving them ownership to start with, just to even approach the conversation. So other phrases might include, can we have a chat when you're free? And are you even open to having a chat to me? So just ensuring that they do consent to, of course, having conversation about something that may be not necessarily related to their academics, and just giving them more of that feeling of control, which is helpful and empowering to them. Unhelpful statements. Saying something like, I urgently need to speak to you, or something that's really, really important, emphasizing that originally, even though it is potentially very important, giving them that cue originally to think it's, or initially to think it's quite something serious. You don't want to exacerbate any sorts of, underlying potential challenges emotionally related to mental illness or some sort of disorder, for instance. Another unhelpful statement may be, you're distracted, it's impacting your grades. So coming to them straight away with the problem and the concern is going to overwhelm and bombard them. So really the whole purpose of this approach stage is to ease them into it and give them just at least an initial, can we have a chat, rather than this is what I've noticed in that moment. So really giving them a bit of space between when you first bring it up and sitting down with them. Of course, this is also not helpful because it's just assuming that they are distracted and telling them how they are and what they're feeling, and also catastrophizing by telling them, well, the impact of this on their grades. And of course, that's potentially going to add to their anxieties and worries rather than help alleviate them. So once we've approached them, we want to communicate what it is that you've noticed. Remember those objective behavioural cues in particular. So something like, I've noticed you've been particularly distracted in class recently and just wanted to make sure everything is okay. So this is a good way to do it. So it's saying what you've already noticed. It's not telling them you're really distracted and it's your problem or issue. It's more saying, I've noticed this and I'm just checking everything's okay, rather than telling them in a punitive sense why this is a problem and what the impact is for them. So it takes a little bit of the pressure off them when you actually have that first conversation, which will help them to open up more. So other things you could say would be, do you find yourself getting distracted? So it's only that you've noticed this and that is your interpretation, but really finding out from their perspective, is this something that they've actually feeling themselves, which also will bring them into taking that ownership and feeling it more of a sense of involvement in the conversation. Also, something you could say is there anything weighing on your mind? So rather than focusing on potentially the negative, which is the distracted, it could be more framed in a positive sense here. Is there anything that's potentially weighing on your mind? So start to think about what's the underlying cause of the distraction rather than going to the more punitive stage. Unhelpful statements may be something like, why are you always so distracted in class? Again, this shows that implies that they're always distracted, which of course probably isn't the case. That generalizing and catastrophizing is not helpful. It can also feel like more of an attack that they're in trouble. And also, what's going on at home at the moment could be that you're assuming there's something clearly going on at home when it may be there's a friendship challenge or something that's happening in the playground at school. So just trying to limit your own assumptions and biases, and we've looked at this previously, to not try and to really have that genuine empathy and think from their perspective and understand from their worldview, rather than casting aspersions and assumptions on your own behalf. And finally, act. Very similar to what we looked at before, asking things such as, what can I do to help support you? And that may be with managing your focus in class or otherwise. So if it is that you've come to the understanding between the two of you that they are having difficulties with their focus or distraction, then that could be something you could play back to them and then say, well, what can I do specifically to help you with that? So that paraphrasing those skills that we've learned in previous webinars, also around the strong connections. So other things you could say here would be, well, how can I help? And empowering them to assign you some way that they would like to get some help. And also, where would you like to go to from here? And as we looked at before, unhelpful things are telling them what they should do and making decisions and actions on their behalf. So if it is to the point that we're going to escalate and there is some sort of agreed action between you and students, where do you escalate? And this may also be in the case where, as we've looked at, there is a need for you to escalate because of the concern that you have around their distress or their safety, for instance. So those particular things that you do think, in your own opinion as a teacher and as part of your duty of care, as to where to escalate. So two key places to escalate is, of course, internally, but also externally. So internally at Kincoppel, there is an extensive framework as to where to escalate when we do want to seek extra support and help for yourself, but also to support your children, their students and their mental well-being. And of course, externally, there are additional resources and tools available to you there. Of course, we've looked at Maximinds, but there's also places like Lifeline, Kids Helpline. Also externally is actually speaking to the parents about your own concerns, and if and when necessary, doctors and health professionals, which could be mediated by, of course, parents. In terms of internally escalating, so at Kincoppel, there is a great framework as to how this process looks, and it starts with you as teachers reaching out to year coordinators. Year coordinators then may decide to involve the counselling team, and currently Izzy is the head of counselling and she looks after year 8 and 12. There's also Steph, who's looking after year 9 and 10, and Erica looks after year 7 and 11. We then have the heads of wellbeing. So that's Scott and Kate Rule. And then the pastoral team managed by Carrie Scanlon is also available if matters need to be escalated further. So knowing for you, if you are a general teacher not in any of these particular roles, then reaching out to your year coordinator is the best first step in terms of escalating any sort of concerns. What the counselling team particularly looks at is assessing students with specific needs. They work collaboratively with teachers and specialist staff, both at the school but also outside, and helps the family to understand and manage their learning and mental health needs, both within the school but also suggestions for outside of the school. They also, as mentioned, liaise with external agencies and other mental health professionals when necessary. So in addition to being able to escalate internally, you can escalate externally. As mentioned, there is a range of resources and extra places that you can go, not only for yourself, but also to get guidance, but also to direct students to. So this is advantageous to have that external point of escalation for those that are wanting to seek independent guidance, potentially want to have that separation between the personal and academic, or for you, the personal versus professional. And they also may have pre-existing knowledge, for instance, in the case of, say, parents or GPs and other support. Even though Kincoppel already has an extensive and very solid, clearly process and protocol for managing internally, externally has the advantage of obviously these, but also has that comfort that they don't necessarily have to speak to someone about their concerns at school to people that are at school. And I think that's quite important, particularly for students, because of things like stigma, particularly. And I just want to give you one example, was that when we spoke to children about using a platform such as Maximinds, for instance, there was one child who actually said that they didn't want to go to the school counsellor because then their friends would call them a loser. And so there is, unfortunately, still this perception that if you go to school, it'll be known amongst friends, teachers, and there's this stigma that they carry. So that is why there is the advantage of having the option to also look externally when necessary. And that goes, as mentioned, for yourself seeking extra assistance in how to deal with these things, but also for students, particularly because of that, the stigma. As we've looked at, Maximinds has extensive resources available to you for free for 3 months, and we've looked, I think, enough at all of these, but a reminder that there are strategies, quizzes, articles, videos, activities online and available to you as to refer to a psychologist. As you'll see, this is all 24/7 online, which means that they can see and access tools that they may need above and beyond outside the work, the school hours at school, and of course work hours when you're working, and even the counselling team. So things, the advantage particularly found of having the online is that for weekends and holidays, particularly over that summer period, they've got access to mental health care tools and resources they need when school does shut down. So it's just always good to have them in mind and available to you. And likewise, in the event of emergency, here are those key contacts for you. And finally, I would like to show you some Maximinds tools that you can use, given we're talking about escalation and where to when mental illness disorders may start to appear and what to do in the first instance. In particular, a safety plan is a great tool that was developed firstly by Beyond Blue and is used a lot by psychologists as a first point of call for when children are demonstrating particularly dark thoughts around suicidal ideation and depression. So, a good tool to use even at a high level when those thoughts and feelings start to develop. And this is just not only for school counsellors but also for teachers. So, I'll just show you a video to show you how this works.
As teachers, you have a responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of your students. Introduce the idea of a safety plan and collaborate with students to create an individualized safety plan that they can refer to when they're not feeling their best. A safety plan involves identifying their warning signs, which are indicators that they're not doing too well. Then consider reasons to live, the things that bring them joy and purpose. Thirdly, determine a safe space, a physical or mental place where they feel secure and calm. And then list some activities, people, places, and things that they can connect with. And finally, ask them to identify someone they can reach out to have a chat with whenever they're feeling down. By having a safety plan in place, we can provide students with tools to navigate difficult times and support their mental well-being. As teachers,
and here is one of the downloadable activities that you can also get online and give to students, and it gives them a framework to actually put pen to paper to help them write down, have on hand, as the video suggests is a good idea, so that they always have it in the event that they're not feeling good, and that's a great tool to use in that instance. And of course, referring to a psychologist if you do think at any point they need that extra assistance, escalating to a psychologist, whether it be as part of the KRB counselling team, somewhere like Maximinds, always better to do so rather than and have it as a preventative measure rather than not. So finally, a summary for what we hopefully learnt today. So extra support and help refers to the additional resources that may be needed in both the short and long term to assist in identifying and managing a student's mental health and illness. You should seek extra support and help to reduce being overloaded yourself as teachers and focus, more importantly, on your role as a teacher and to help also ensure early detection and intervention of mental illness in students. You should escalate when you feel the situation's beyond your expertise, capacity, and/or comfort level, and/or when you notice warning signs, change behaviour, atypical behaviour, clinically significant distress in students for at least a 2-week period, and/or, most importantly, if students are in danger. Escalate by validating, listening, and acting when students raise concerns with you, and by approaching, communicating, and acting to raise concerns with students in the first instance. From there, you can escalate internally at KRB or externally by a range of professional online and 24/7 services. So further to that, the resources again for you, as always, are here, emergency contacts, particularly in light of what we're talking about today. This is important to always have on hand. And as mentioned, of course, there are many tools and available resources, not only for you, but also your students at Maximinds. And finally, here are my contact details. If you have any other further questions at all, please feel free to reach out with any questions at all. It's been an excellent 8 weeks. Thank you all KRB teachers. I hope you have learnt a few things and look forward to seeing you again in the future.